12 years ago. I became a ghost in another man's life, and I discovered that being invisible is the most painful way to exist. The rain in Portland was washing the city's memories clean while Michael adjusted the shawl around Robert's shoulders, his calloused fingers moving with a surgeon's precision that betrayed every rough line of work in his hands. 12 years had passed since he had answered that newspaper ad. Companion needed for lonely elderly man, never imagining that companion would mean the gradual disappearance of his own identity. Robert Hayes, 78 years old, lived in a parallel world built on the ruins of a tragedy from 40 years earlier. His pregnant wife had died in a car accident, taking with her not just one life, but two, her own, and that of the child who would never be born. From that double absence, Robert had created a single answer: Megan, the imagined daughter who filled the void reality had left behind. And Michael, a 42-year-old nurse with no family of his own, had become that fantasy. Every morning, he applied the makeup that softened his masculine features, put on the clothes Robert had come to associate with the daughter who never existed, and stepped into the role that had consumed his life. The transformation was not only physical. It was a daily death of his authentic self, a silent sacrifice that no one ever witnessed. The house was a museum of invented memories. Photos of Megan at different ages, each one really Michael in a different wig and a carefully chosen angle. Birthday cards he wrote himself and then received with theatrical gratitude. Gifts he bought with his own money, only to watch the light in Robert's eyes when he got them. That rainy afternoon, while Robert looked at him with the tenderness he reserved only for Megan, Michael felt the weight of 12 years of compassionate lies. It was not the falsehood that crushed him, but the truth behind it, the genuine love that had grown in the fertile soil of fantasy. Two lonely men, bound by a necessary fiction, finding in the spaces between the lies a connection more authentic than any truth could ever offer. Michael studied the photos on the wall. Robert as a young man beside the wife he had never known, both smiling at a future that would be stolen from them. And he wondered, not for the first time, who was actually saving whom in this strange relationship. Robert had his imaginary daughter, but Michael had the emptiness of being nobody to someone, and someone to nobody. The ritual of the 6 o'clock tea was always the same, the fine porcelain cups Robert insisted on using, the chamomile tea he claimed was Megan's favorite, the one-sided conversation in which Michael answered Robert's questions with the responses he knew the old man wanted to hear. It was a dance they had choreographed over 12 years, each movement calculated to keep the fragile alternate reality intact. But that afternoon, something changed. When Robert reached out his trembling hand and stroked his face, calling him my good girl, Michael felt a crack open in his emotional armor. It was not the touch that hurt, but the purity of the love behind it, a love meant for a person who did not exist, received by a man who could not fully exist. He looked at his reflection in the rain-fogged window, his face partly transformed by makeup, his broad shoulders disguised beneath a woman's cardigan, his eyes carrying the weight of a decade of voluntary invisibility. And in that moment, Michael understood the price he was paying to ease another man's loneliness, the loneliness of never being truly seen. The rain kept tapping steadily against the glass, as if it was trying to wash away the layers of fiction wrapped around that house. But some stains were too deep for water to reach, stains of lost identity, of love given under false pretenses, of sacrifices no one would ever know about. And Michael, sitting in the armchair beside Robert, realized that he had become so good at playing Megan that he no longer knew where the character ended and the man began. What began as a compassionate lie became the most painful truth I have ever carried, that you can love someone deeply through a persona that never existed. The years had woven a complex tapestry of shared rituals between Michael and Robert, each one a thread strengthening the fabric of the alternate reality they lived in. Sunday mornings were devoted to the photo albums Robert insisted on revisiting, page by page, like an archaeologist digging through his own invented memories. Michael knew every picture, every story attached to them, better than he knew his own real life. There was the photo of Megan's supposed 7th birthday at the zoo. In reality, Michael in a blonde wig and a blue dress, posing in front of the lion's enclosure while a kind stranger took the picture. Robert told the story with such detail that Michael could almost smell cotton candy and hear the distant roars. The false memory had become more vivid than many of his real ones. Wednesday afternoons were reserved for walks in the park, where Robert proudly introduced his daughter to the neighbors. Michael had learned to walk with a grace that did not come naturally to his body, to tilt his head in a particular way when greeting people, to laugh in a higher tone that sounded strange in his own ears. Every performance was a small murder of his authentic self, but the sparkle in Robert's eyes always felt like enough justification for the crime. The true test came on stormy nights, when lightning lit up the house and thunder made Robert shake. Those were the moments when Michael let the persona of Megan fall away completely and simply held the old man's hands, offering basic human comfort, not staged filial affection. In those hours, something interesting happened. Robert seemed to see through the fantasy, his eyes finding Michael's with a recognition that went beyond the character. It was during one of those particularly violent storms that Michael found the box in the attic. While Robert finally slept, exhausted from fear, he climbed the creaking stairs driven by a curiosity that frightened him. The wooden box, hidden behind old blankets, held not Megan's memories, but Robert's. Letters never sent to his dead wife, photos of the real couple, hospital documents confirming the loss of both wife and child. And there, among papers yellowed by time, Michael found the truth that would change everything, a journal in which Robert confessed that he knew Megan did not exist. Page after page of shaky handwriting admitting that he knew Michael was his nurse, not his daughter. But he preferred the loving company of a stranger to the crushing loneliness of the truth. The revelation was an earthquake in Michael's soul. 12 years of sacrifice, 12 years of gradually disappearing, and Robert had always known. It was not dementia, it was not confusion. It was a conscious choice to embrace fiction because reality was too unbearable to face alone. The next morning, when Robert called him Megan with that love-soaked voice, Michael looked into the old man's eyes and saw something he had never noticed before, a glint of complicity, a silent understanding that both of them were willingly participating in the fantasy. It was not a lie forced upon a sick man. It was a pact between two lonely adults searching for comfort inside a shared illusion. The rituals continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Michael was no longer playing a role in order to deceive a confused man. He was taking part in a dance they were choreographing together, where both knew the steps and chose to dance anyway. The love he felt for Robert was no longer rooted in pity or professional duty. It was genuine, born from sharing the alternate reality they had built side by side. And with that understanding came the sharpest pain of all, knowing that this deep bond, this authentic connection, existed inside a structure that would one day inevitably collapse. They had built a home on foundations of sand, and Michael could feel the tide of reality drawing near. But our perfect connection woke up a ghost from the past that could not be fooled by makeup or invented stories, reality itself, embodied in a woman who carried the blood I never had. The threat arrived on a bright spring Saturday, dressed in the relentless authority of blood ties. Sarah Jenkins, Robert's niece, appeared at the front door with a folder of documents and an expression that left no space for fantasies. She had come from Arizona, summoned by inheritance matters after the death of her mother, Robert's only sister. Michael opened the door still wearing the silk robe Robert associated with Megan, his face half made up from his mourning preparations. The shock on Sarah's face was instantaneous. First confusion, then gradual understanding, and finally horror. She looked at Michael, at the house decorated with photos of the non-existent daughter, and then back at him with an expression that mixed disgust and pity. Robert, seated in his favorite armchair, tried to introduce his daughter Megan, but Sarah cut the scene short with a coldness that made Michael shiver. She knew the story, the tragic accident, the pregnant wife dead, the fact that Robert had never had children. Her mother had told her everything, worried about her brother's mental health after decades of unresolved mourning. The following days became a silent battlefield between carefully constructed fiction and unyielding reality. Sarah inspected the house like a forensic expert, methodically dismantling every piece of the alternate narrative. She questioned the photos, pointing out inconsistencies in ages and settings. She examined receipts, noticing that every purchase had been made by Michael. She read the journals Michael had discovered, confirming that her uncle had always known the truth. But the most devastating blow came when Sarah found the will. In a rare moment of clarity years earlier, Robert had left everything to my niece Sarah, specifically noting that he had no living children. The document was the legal proof that destroyed any possibility of Megan existing outside the imagination of two lonely men. Michael watched helplessly as Sarah tore down 12 years of his life. Each document she produced, each fact she stated, was another shovelful of earth thrown onto Megan's grave. He saw confusion grow in Robert's face, reality beginning to break through the defenses that had protected his sanity for so long. The tension in the house became palpable, a third invisible character poisoning the air they breathed. Sarah insisted on calling Michael by his real name, refusing to take part in what she called a sick farce. She talked about putting Robert in a nursing home, about selling the property, about normalizing the situation, words that sounded like death sentences for the world Michael and Robert had built together. Robert began to regress, his few lucid hours growing rarer and shorter. He called Michael Megan more often, as if he were trying to reinforce his preferred reality against the assault of the truth. But there were moments, brief, agonizing moments, when his eyes met Michael's and he seemed to understand exactly what was happening. In those flashes, Michael saw not only fear, but a deep sadness for the imminent loss of the world he had chosen to inhabit. Sarah scheduled a meeting with a lawyer for the following week, determined to take legal control of the situation. She spoke of official diagnoses, treatments, and doing what was best for Robert, always with scornful glances at Michael, as if he were an opportunist who had preyed on a sick man. What Sarah did not understand, what she could never understand, was that Michael was not there for money or obligation. He was there because, somewhere in the midst of that shared lie, he had found a truth about himself that reality had never offered him, that he was capable of loving someone so deeply that he was willing to vanish completely in order to sustain that love. The threat was not Sarah herself, but what she represented, the real world with its inflexible truths, its impersonal bureaucracy, its inability to comprehend that sometimes fiction can heal more than reality. And Michael knew, with a certainty that hurt in every fiber of his being, that he was about to lose not only Robert, but the only version of himself that had ever felt complete. Faced with the relentless truth Sarah brought, I had to choose between protecting the man who had given me a purpose or honoring the man I had become through that purpose, and I discovered that the right choice is usually the one that hurts the most. The night before the meeting with the lawyer fell over the house like a veil of anticipated mourning. Sarah had gone to a hotel, leaving Michael and Robert alone with the weight of what was coming. The tension of the last few days had created a new kind of silence between them, not the comfortable quiet of the previous years, but the heavy silence of an unspoken goodbye. Michael watched Robert asleep in the armchair, his face relaxed in an expression of peace that was becoming increasingly rare. 12 years of sacrifice had led to this moment of decision. He could continue the fantasy, fight Sarah in court, try to prove that his relationship with Robert was more real than any legal document. Or he could accept reality, help Sarah place Robert in a suitable nursing home, and disappear from the old man's life forever. But as he walked through the dim house, his hands brushing over the objects that had become silent witnesses to his transformation, Michael realized that both options were versions of the same surrender. Continuing the lie meant accepting that he would never be seen as Michael. Accepting the truth meant accepting that the love he felt was invalid because it had been born from fiction. Then he found the wooden box in the attic again, and inside it, something he had not noticed before, a letter addressed to him. Michael, not Megan. Robert's trembling handwriting dated it 3 years earlier, a time when he had seemed particularly lucid. In the letter, Robert thanked Michael not for being Megan, but for being Michael. He wrote about how he had known the truth from the beginning, about how he had chosen to embrace the fantasy because the reality of being a widower with no family was too painful. He asked forgiveness for asking Michael to disappear in order to fill his emptiness, and he expressed gratitude for the genuine love that had grown between them, regardless of the names they used. The revelation was an earthquake that reshaped everything. Robert was not a passive victim of dementia. He was an active participant in building the alternate reality. And Michael was not a compassionate liar. He was a friend who had agreed to enter someone else's world because that person could not bear his own. In the small hours of the morning, while the city slept and the stars shone coldly through the attic window, Michael made his decision. It would not be about choosing between truth and lie, between Michael and Megan. It would be about honoring the love that existed between two human beings, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. When Sarah arrived the next morning, ready for legal battle, Michael greeted her not as Megan, but as Michael, no makeup, no women's clothing, just himself. He showed her the letter, explained what had truly happened over the last 12 years, not as a story of deceit, but as a story of love between two lonely men who had found comfort in each other. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her hardened expression gradually softening as she absorbed the truth. She had seen Michael only as an opportunist or as someone mentally ill, never considering that this bizarre situation could have been born from something genuine. Michael's choice was not about winning or losing, about proving that Megan was real or that Michael was valid. It was about letting go of control, about trusting that the love he and Robert shared was strong enough to survive the transition from fantasy to reality. He agreed to help Sarah with the transition, to find a suitable nursing home where Robert could receive proper care. But he made one demand, that he could continue to visit Robert as Michael, his friend, not as Megan, his imaginary daughter. In that moment of surrender, of accepting reality with all its imperfections, Michael felt a strange peace. He was not choosing between truth and lie, but between love conditioned by fantasy and love offered unconditionally to the person, regardless of context. The hardest choice was not what to do with Robert, but who he, Michael, would choose to be from that day on, the ghost of a daughter who had never existed, or the real man who had learned to love deeply. My choice for the truth cost me the only father I ever knew, and I discovered that reality can be far more cruel than the most painful fiction. The move to the nursing home was a methodical dismantling of 12 years of shared life. Every object Michael packed was another piece of Megan being sealed into cardboard boxes, every photograph taken off the wall of memory being archived as evidence of a crime that had never actually occurred. Sarah oversaw the process with clinical efficiency, treating the situation as a logistical problem to solve, not as the funeral of a relationship that had been more real than any official record. Robert was taken to Sunset Gardens assisted living on a rainy April morning. He stared out the car window with a look of deep confusion, his trembling fingers tapping the glass as if trying to touch a world that was slipping away. Michael followed in a separate cab, his heart heavy with the guilt of having helped dismantle the only home Robert had known. The first days in the nursing home were a rapid decline. Far from his familiar rituals, far from the objects that held up his alternate reality, Robert retreated into an almost catatonic state. He no longer responded to the name Megan, but he did not recognize Michael as Michael either. His eyes passed over people as if they were ghosts, his mind stepping back into a place where neither truth nor fiction could reach him. Michael visited every day, sitting beside the hospital bed where Robert now spent most of his time sleeping or staring at the ceiling. He tried to talk about real memories, the walks in the park, the storms, the tea rituals, but the words echoed in the sterile room without any response. The person he had loved was still there physically, but the essence that had bound them together had withdrawn to an unreachable place. Sarah appeared rarely, busy with selling the house and managing the inheritance. She justified her absence with the ruthless logic of reality. Robert was receiving professional care, the situation was normalized, it was time to move on. Her visits were brief, filled with one-sided conversations about practical matters that Robert could no longer understand. Michael, on the other hand, sank deeper into the emptiness his choice had created. Without Robert to care for, without Megan to inhabit, he was only a 42-year-old man with no family, no purpose, no clear identity. His life felt as empty as the nursing home room where he sat each day beside the ghost of the man who had once been his entire world. The lowest point came on a particularly dark afternoon, when Michael arrived for his daily visit and found Robert in a rare window of lucidity. His eyes were clear, focused, and when he saw Michael, a genuine smile lit up his wrinkled face. "Michael," he said, his voice weak but aware. "Thank you for coming." For a moment, Michael felt a spark of hope. Perhaps the truth could be the beginning of a new relationship, honest and real. But then Robert looked around, confused by the stark environment, and his expression turned to pure panic. "Where is Megan?" he asked, his eyes searching desperately for the daughter who did not exist. "What have you done with my daughter?" Michael tried to explain, tried to tell the truth that had cost them so much, but he watched the confusion in Robert's eyes twist into anguish, then into despair, and finally into resignation. The lucidity lasted only a few minutes before Robert pulled back again into the darkness, his gaze losing focus, his mind closing its doors to a world that had shown itself to be too painful. In that moment, Michael understood the full cost of his choice. By choosing the truth, he had not only lost Robert, he had lost the version of himself that had been loved unconditionally, even under a false name. He had lost the purpose that had given meaning to his days. He had lost the family he had chosen, even if it had been built on sand. He left the nursing home that afternoon carrying the weight of 12 years of sacrifice ending in failure. The truth had not set anyone free. It had only exchanged one kind of suffering for another. And Michael, sitting alone in his empty apartment, realized that sometimes the most painful fiction is preferable to the rawest reality. The fall was not about losing Robert to dementia. It was about losing himself to the truth. But at the bottom, I discovered that the secret was never about me playing a daughter, but about two lonely men learning that love does not need labels to be real. Rock bottom arrived on a night in May, when Michael received a call from the nursing home telling him that Robert had pneumonia and his chances were slim. Rushing down the hospital corridor, he braced himself for the worst, to say goodbye to a man who had not recognized him for weeks, to bury not only Robert, but the entire story they had shared. But when he walked into the room, he found something completely unexpected. Robert was awake, his eyes unnaturally lucid, holding a yellowed envelope that Sarah had brought from the house during the final clean-out. It was a letter Robert had written years before, addressed to Michael, with specific instructions to be opened when the real world finally catches up with us. With trembling hands, Michael opened the letter while Robert watched him with a peace he had not seen in months. And in those carefully written words, he found not a farewell, but a blessing. Robert confessed that he had known the truth from the very first day. He told how, after his wife's death, he had created Megan not as a sick fantasy but as a living testament to the love he had felt, a way to keep alive the possibility of the family he had lost. And when Michael appeared, Robert had seen in him not a substitute for the daughter who never existed, but a friend willing to step into his world to ease his loneliness. The letter explained that Megan had never been about deceit or dementia. She had been about two men giving each other exactly what they needed, Robert offering Michael a purpose and a family. Michael offering Robert companionship and unconditional love. The fantasy had been only the vehicle, not the destination. "You were not playing my daughter," Robert said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You were being my friend when I needed one the most. Megan was only the name we gave to the love we shared." In that moment, everything fell into place. The 12 years had not been about Michael disappearing in order to become someone he was not. They had been about him discovering who he truly was through the act of loving someone without conditions. Megan's persona had not been a prison, but a doorway through which two human beings had managed to connect more deeply than conventional reality would ever have allowed. Sarah, watching from the doorway, finally understood. She had only ever seen the bizarre surface of the situation, never its core of humanity. And with that understanding, her judgment gave way to admiration for Michael, who had loved her uncle enough to erase himself for his sake, and for Robert, who had found a way to survive loss through creativity and love. In the days that followed, as Robert fought the pneumonia, something extraordinary happened. Without the pressure of maintaining the fantasy, without Sarah's shadow of judgment hanging over them, Michael and Robert began to build a new relationship, authentic, based on the truth of who they were and the love they had shared, regardless of the circumstances. Robert stopped calling Michael Megan, not because he forgot the persona, but because he understood that the name no longer mattered. What mattered was the man sitting beside him, holding his hand, offering comfort with no disguise. And Michael finally stopped seeing himself as an imposter and began to see himself as what he truly was, a human being who had loved another human being deeply, full stop. The turning point was not about fixing something broken, but about realizing that nothing had been broken in the first place. Two lonely men had found exactly what they needed in each other, and the vehicle they had used for that connection was secondary to the connection itself. And Michael, sitting beside the hospital bed with Robert's hand in his, realized that the greatest truth he had discovered was not about Robert or Megan, but about himself, that he was capable of a love so deep that he was willing to transcend his own identity in order to express it. The secret was not that he had played a daughter for 12 years. The secret was that, in the process, he had become real family. The final confrontation with death revealed not only the power of unconditional love, but the eternal truth that the truest families are the ones we build from the broken pieces of our lives. Robert died on a quiet June morning, not in agony, but in peace. His last moments were spent holding Michael's hand, his eyes finding the gaze of the man who had been his daughter, his friend, his family, all at once, without contradiction. There were no dramatic last words, only a soft exhale and a final smile that seemed to say, "Thank you for everything." The funeral was small, intimate. Sarah was there, no longer the distant, judgmental niece, but a woman transformed by her understanding of what had really happened between her uncle and Michael. She spoke briefly, not about the tragedy of the past, but about the redemption found in Robert's final years, how two lonely men had created something beautiful out of suffering. Michael did not wear black. He dressed in the colors Robert had always associated with Megan, a light blue sweater that matched the old man's eyes. It was not an act of denial or a return to fantasy, but a tribute to the love they had shared in all its complex forms. After the funeral, as the few guests drifted away, Sarah handed Michael a box Robert had prepared for him. Inside, there was no money, no valuables, but something infinitely more precious. Robert's complete journal, from the day of the accident to his last conscious entries. In the final pages, Michael found the truth that redefined everything. Robert had written that Michael had not saved him from loneliness by playing Megan. He had saved him by proving that it was still possible to love and be loved exactly as he was, with all his wounds and fantasies. Megan's persona had not been a prison from which Robert needed to be freed, but a garden where their love could bloom far from the world's judgment. "The greatest gift you gave me," Robert had written, "was not pretending to be my daughter, but making me feel that I was still worthy of being a father, even if only in imagination. And in the process, you became my son in truth, not by blood, but by something far stronger, by choice." Michael closed the journal with tears in his eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. He finally understood that the 12 years had not been about sacrifice or loss of identity. They had been about discovering that the purest love is the one we give without expecting anything in return, not even recognition for who we are when we offer it. In the months that followed, Michael did not fall into the emptiness he had feared. Instead, he found a renewed purpose. He began volunteering at an organization that supported lonely elderly people, not by playing roles, but simply by being present, listening to stories, offering company, reminding people that they mattered. Sarah, surprisingly, became a true friend. She traveled from Arizona to visit him regularly, their conversations now filled with the understanding shared only by those who have witnessed something extraordinary together. She even joked that Michael was the cousin she had never had, an irony they both cherished. Michael's final transformation was not about becoming someone new, but about integrating every part of who he had always been. The man who had played Megan, the nurse who had cared for Robert, the friend who had loved unconditionally, all of them were him, and none of them were less real than the others. He kept some of Megan's clothes, not as a morbid attachment, but as a reminder that identity is fluid, and that love can turn us into versions of ourselves we never thought possible. Sometimes, on particularly lonely nights, he put on the pink cardigan Robert had loved so much and felt not the pain of loss, but the comforting presence of a love that outlives death. Robert and Michael's legacy was not a story of dementia or deception, but a lesson in the transforming power of unconditional love. It showed that sometimes the truest families are the ones we create from the ashes of our tragedies, and that the most authentic love is the one that accepts every part of us, even the parts we would rather hide. And Michael, living alone but never truly lonely, carried with him the truth Robert had left as his final inheritance, that being loved for who you truly are, with all your complexities and contradictions, is the only miracle that really matters.